We arrived at the island just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, ominous shadows over the jagged rocks that lined the shore. The place was everything the legends had promised. A desolate, forsaken chunk of land in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by endless waves and whispers of treasure buried deep within its heart. But there was something else too, a sense of unease, as if the island itself was watching us, waiting. Our group of 5, each of us hardened by years of chasing rumors and surviving on nothing more than the thrill of discovery, felt the tension. We didn't talk about it, not yet. But it was there, gnawing at the edges of our thoughts like rats in the walls of an abandoned house. The first signs of something wrong came as soon as we stepped off the boat. The air was thick, humid, and carried a scent that none of us could place. Metallic, almost sweet, like rusted iron left to rot in the sun. The jungle loomed ahead, dark and tangled, its trees twisted into grotesque shapes that seemed almost human in the fading light. But the promise of riches pulled us forward, deeper into the island's maw. We set up camp a few hundred yards from the shore, in a small clearing surrounded by towering trees. As the others busied themselves with pitching tents and gathering firewood, I wandered off, unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The island was silent, too silent. No birds, no insects, not even the rustle of leaves in the wind. Just the sound of my own breathing, growing more ragged with each step. And then I saw it, a web. Not just any web, but a massive, sprawling thing that hung between 2 trees like a gossamer veil, glistening in the dying light. The strands were as thick as rope, shimmering with an oily sheen, and at its center lay something that turned my blood to ice. A human skull, picked clean and bleached white by time, hung suspended in the web's sticky embrace. Its empty eye socket stared back at me, a silent warning from whatever horror had claimed this place. I staggered back, heart pounding, and nearly tripped over something on the ground. Another bone, this one still flecked with bits of dried flesh. "Hey, you alright?" One of the others called out from the camp, his voice breaking the eerie silence. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My mind raced as I backed away from the web, trying to convince myself that it was just an old relic, a gruesome reminder of the dangers that awaited us. But deep down I knew better. There was something here, something far worse than we could have imagined. Night fell quickly on the island, the darkness settling in like a shroud, thick and suffocating. The fire we built did little to chase away the shadows that crept ever closer, and the silence was unbearable. We sat in a tight circle, eyes darting nervously at every flicker of movement beyond the reach of the flames. Then, just as the tension reached its breaking point, a scream pierced the night. It was one of the others, a sharp, agonized cry that sent us scrambling to our feet, weapons drawn. But by the time we reached his tent, it was too late. The fabric was shredded, slashed apart by something with claws sharper than any knife. Blood pooled on the ground, dark and sticky, but there was no sign of him. Just the gaping, torn remains of what had once been a man. Panic set in. We argued, shouted, tried to make sense of what had happened. But the truth was staring us in the face, undeniable and horrifying. We weren't alone on this island. Something was hunting us. Something that moved in the shadows, unseen and unstoppable. As we huddled together trying to plan our escape, the jungle around us came alive with sound. It started as a faint rustling, like leaves brushing against each other in the breeze. But it grew, louder and closer, until it surrounded us on all sides. The firelight flickered, casting wild dancing shadows on the trees, and in those shadows I saw them. Spiders, hundreds of them, their massive bodies gleaming in the firelight, their legs clicking against the ground as they crept closer and closer. They were unlike anything I had ever seen, twice the size of a man, with fangs that dripped venom and eyes that glowed with a malevolent intelligence. And they weren't just moving towards us, they were surrounding us, cutting off every route of escape. We were trapped. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched them close in, their movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring our terror. And then, just as they reached the edge of the firelight, they stopped. For a moment the world seemed to hold its breath, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the frantic beating of my own heart. Then, without warning, the spiders surged forward, a wave of black, chitinous bodies that crashed over us like a living tide. We fought, we screamed, but it was no use. They were too many, too strong. One by one, I watched as my companions were dragged into the darkness, their screams cut off abruptly as the spiders tore them apart. And then it was my turn. A pair of gleaming eyes locked onto mine, and I felt the cold, paralyzing fear grip me as the spider lunged, its fangs bared, ready to strike. I closed my eyes, bracing for the end. But it never came. Instead, the spider hesitated, its fangs inches from my throat, and then to my horror it spoke. Not with words, but with thoughts. Dark, twisted thoughts that wormed their way into my mind, filling it with images of pain, of suffering, of things no human should ever witness. I tried to scream, to fight back, but the spider's will was too strong. It held me there, pinned to the ground by its gaze, as it slowly, methodically began to weave its web around me. The sticky strands wrapped around my limbs, my chest, my throat until I could barely breathe. The last thing I saw before the darkness claimed me was the spider's eyes, gleaming with a horrifying intelligence, and the realization that this was only the beginning. The island had claimed its first victims, and I was next. When I came to, the first thing I felt was the overwhelming pressure of the web constricting around my body. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and I could barely move, pinned to the ground like some grotesque specimen in a deranged collector's display. My mind raced as I tried to piece together what had happened, but every attempt to think was drowned out by the memories of those glowing eyes, the voice that wasn't a voice, and the sickening realization that we had walked straight into a trap. I couldn't see much, just the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the dense canopy above and the twisted shapes of the trees that seemed to close in on me from all sides. The fire had died, leaving only smoldering embers, but I could hear them. The spiders. They were close, their movements barely audible but unmistakable. The soft scuttle of their legs on the ground, the occasional clack of their fangs as they clicked together in anticipation. I wasn't alone. A low, pained groan reached my ears, and I turned my head as far as I could, straining against the web that held me down. There, just a few feet away, was one of the others. A man I had known for years, now reduced to a quivering, broken thing. His face was pale, drawn with fear, and his eyes were wide with the kind of terror that no human should ever have to experience. His body was wrapped in webbing, just like mine, but there was something else. Something moving beneath the surface. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, a product of the horror I'd witnessed. But then I saw it, something bulging, writhing just beneath his skin. He let out another groan, this one filled with an unbearable agony, and I realized with growing dread what was happening. The spiders hadn't killed him. They had laid their eggs inside him. Panic surged through me, and I thrashed against the web, desperate to free myself. But it only tightened, constricting around my chest and cutting off my breath. I could feel the strands digging into my skin, sticky and cold, as if the web itself was alive, feeding off my fear. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain through my body. But I couldn't stop. I had to get out, had to escape before the same fate befell me. The man beside me let out a final, choked gasp, and then he went still. For a moment the night was silent again, and I dared to hope that he had finally found peace. But that hope was shattered when his chest burst open with a sickening wet crack. Dozens of tiny spiders, no larger than my hand, spilled out, their bodies slick with blood and viscera. They swarmed over his lifeless form, their legs moving with unnatural speed as they fed on the remains of what had once been my friend. The sight was so grotesque, so utterly wrong that I nearly blacked out again. But something kept me conscious, some deep primal instinct that knew I had to survive. Through the haze of terror, I became aware of movement at the edge of my vision. Something large, something that didn't belong to this world. I forced myself to look, even as every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn away. It was another spider, but this one was different, bigger, much bigger, and there was a cruel intelligence in its eyes that made my skin crawl. It moved with a deliberate grace, its legs barely making a sound as it approached, its body covered in a thick, bristling fur that seemed to absorb the light around it. As it drew closer, I could see the gleam of its fangs, long and curved, dripping with venom that hissed and sizzled when it hit the ground. But the worst part wasn't the spider itself. It was what it carried in its mandibles. There, hanging limply from its jaws, was the body of another one of my companions. He was still alive, barely, his eyes fluttering weakly as the spider dropped him at my feet. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his body was covered in those same writhing bulges that I had seen in the man beside me. The spider watched me with those cold, gleaming eyes as it began to spin another web around him, working quickly, efficiently, as if it had done this 1,000 times before. I wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but I knew it was useless. The spider wasn't just hunting us. It was playing with us, toying with our minds as much as our bodies. And the worst part was, I could feel its thoughts pressing in on my mind again, dark and twisted, filling my head with images of pain and death. It wanted me to watch. It wanted me to see what was going to happen to my friend, to know that the same fate awaited me. I tried to look away, to close my eyes, but I couldn't. Something was holding me there, forcing me to witness every horrifying moment as the spider finished its work and left him there, twitching and gasping, the life slowly draining from his eyes. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the spider turned its attention to me. It moved closer, so close that I could feel its breath on my face. could smell the foul stench of decay that clung to its fur. Its fangs hovered inches from my throat, and I braced myself for the end, for the searing pain that would signal the start of my own slow, agonizing death. But instead it stopped. It paused, as if considering something. And then it did something that made my blood run cold. It whispered my name. Not aloud, but in my mind, the voice echoing through my thoughts like a dark, malevolent presence. It knew who I was. It knew everything about me. My fears, my weaknesses, my darkest secrets. And it was going to use them against me. With a final, chilling hiss, the spider backed away, leaving me bound and helpless in its web. It wasn't going to kill me. Not yet. It had something far worse in mind. Something that I could only begin to imagine. As I lay there, struggling to breathe, I realized with growing dread that this was only the beginning. The island wasn't just a place of death. It was a place of nightmares, and we had walked straight into its trap. The true horror was yet to come. The hours bled together in a haze of pain and terror, the night stretching on endlessly as the island seemed to come alive around me. I lay there, cocooned in the sticky web, helpless to move or even think beyond the immediate horror of my situation. Every breath was a struggle, every heartbeat a reminder that I was still alive, trapped in a nightmare from which there was no waking. The others were gone now, taken one by the spiders and subjected to fates too horrifying to comprehend. I could still hear their screams echoing in the back of my mind, mingling with the dark whispers that the spiders pressed into my thoughts, filling my head with visions of torment and despair. The line between reality and madness blurred, and I wasn't sure how much more I could take before I lost myself entirely. But then, as if sensing my fraying sanity, the island gave me a brief, cruel reprieve. The spiders seemed to retreat, their movements growing more distant, the oppressive weight of their presence lifting just enough for me to catch my breath. I wasn't free, far from it, but the pause in their assault gave me a moment to think, to plan. I couldn't stay here, that much was clear. The spiders weren't going to kill me outright. They had something far worse in mind, and I knew I had to escape before they returned to finish whatever twisted game they were playing. But the web held me fast, its strands digging into my flesh like iron shackles. Every attempt to move only tightened its grip, sending fresh waves of pain through my body. Still, I had to try. The thought of staying here, helpless and alone, was more terrifying than anything the spiders could do to me. Gritting my teeth against the pain, I began to work my hand free, inch by agonizing inch. The web resisted, clinging to my skin, but I forced myself to keep going, focusing on the rhythm of my breathing, the steady beat of my heart. I couldn't afford to panic. Not now. Finally, after what felt like hours, my hand slipped free. I nearly cried out in relief, but I bit down hard, stifling the sound. I wasn't out of this yet. Using my free hand, I began to tear at the web around my body, each movement slow and deliberate, mindful of the spiders that could return at any moment. The web tore easily enough, but the strands clung to me like they were alive, resisting my every effort to free myself. My hands were slick with sweat and blood, my muscles screaming in protest, but I kept going, driven by the primal urge to survive. Inch by inch, I worked my way out, until finally I was able to sit up, the last of the web falling away from my body. I was free, but I wasn't safe. The jungle loomed around me, dark and silent, the trees twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to mock my escape. I had no idea where the others had gone, no idea how to get off the island, but I couldn't stay here. I had to move, had to put as much distance between myself and the spiders as possible before they returned. I stumbled to my feet, every part of my body aching, and began to stagger away from the camp, deeper into the jungle. The undergrowth was thick, the ground uneven, but I forced myself to keep going, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant death. My breath came in ragged gasps, the darkness pressing in on all sides, but I didn't dare look back. I had to keep moving. The jungle seemed to close in around me, the trees forming a dense, impenetrable wall that blocked out the moonlight, leaving me in near total darkness. I could hear the rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs beneath my feet, but the spiders were silent, too silent. It was as if they were waiting, watching, letting me tire myself out before they struck again. The thought filled me with a cold dread, and I quickened my pace, pushing through the thick foliage with all the strength I could muster. My heart pounded in my chest, my body slick with sweat, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop, not now. Then, just as I began to think I might have escaped, I saw it, a faint, flickering light in the distance, barely visible through the dense undergrowth. It was small, weak, but it was enough to give me hope. Perhaps one of the others had survived. Perhaps they had found shelter, away off the island. I had to find out. I pushed forward, ignoring the pain that flared with every step, the fear that gnawed at my mind. The light grew brighter as I approached, and I could see now that it was a fire, a small flickering flame that danced in the darkness, casting long, eerie shadows on the ground. But as I drew closer, I realized with growing dread that something was wrong. The fire was burning in the middle of a clearing, but there was no sign of the others, no sign of life at all. Just the fire and something strange in the center of the clearing. I stepped into the clearing, my breath catching in my throat as I saw what it was. A large circular pit had been dug into the ground, its edges lined with smooth, polished stones. And in the center of the pit, suspended above the fire by a series of thick ropes, was a cage. A cage made entirely of bones. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I took in the sight. The bones were old, yellowed with age, and they had been lashed together with some kind of sinew, forming a crude but effective prison. Inside the cage, something moved, a dark shape that shifted and twisted in the flickering light. I took a step closer, my mind racing with questions, with fear. But the moment I did, the shape inside the cage stopped moving. Slowly, painfully slowly, it turned to face me. It was a man, or at least it had once been a man. His body was emaciated, the skin stretched tight over his bones, and his eyes were wide, staring, filled with a terror that mirrored my own. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. Just a low, rattling breath that sent a shiver down my spine. And then, with a sudden jerking motion, he lunged at the bars of the cage, his skeletal hands reaching out for me, his mouth twisting into a grotesque grin. I stumbled back, my heart racing, as the man began to laugh, a high, keening sound that echoed through the clearing, sending birds scattering from the trees above. It was a sound of madness, of despair, and it filled me with a deep, bone-chilling fear. I turned to run, but before I could take a step, something moved in the darkness beyond the clearing. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I saw them. Dozens of spiders, their massive bodies gleaming in the firelight, their eyes fixed on me with a predatory intelligence. They had been watching, waiting for me to find the pit, to see what they had done, and now they were ready to strike. I didn't wait for them to move. I turned and ran, my mind filled with the sound of that man's laughter, with the image of those spiders closing in around me. The jungle blurred around me as I pushed myself to run faster, faster, my legs burning with the effort, my lungs screaming for air. But no matter how fast I ran, I could still hear them, scuttling through the undergrowth, their legs clicking against the ground as they closed in. The spiders weren't just hunting me, they were hurting me, driving me deeper into the jungle towards something far worse than the pit. And as I ran, I realized with a sickening certainty that there was no escape. The island was alive, a living nightmare that had claimed countless lives before mine, and it wasn't going to let me go. The true horror was still to come. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were made of lead as I sprinted through the jungle, the sounds of the spiders closing in behind me. Every shadow seemed to reach out. Every rustling leaf sent a jolt of fear through my body. But there was no time to think, no time to do anything but run. The spiders were relentless, their dark gleaming eyes fixed on me, their hunger palpable in the air. But as I stumbled through the undergrowth, my mind racing with terror, something unexpected happened. I tripped. My foot caught on a root and I went down hard, skidding across the dirt and leaves. For a moment, I lay there dazed, the world spinning around me. The spiders were getting closer, their legs clicking on the ground. But as I tried to push myself up, I noticed something strange. The ground beneath me wasn't just dirt. It was smooth, almost metallic. I brushed away the leaves, my fingers trembling, and uncovered what looked like a hatch, a heavy, rusted metal door set into the ground, nearly hidden by the undergrowth. My heart skipped a beat. Could this be a way out? I didn't have time to think. I grabbed the edge of the hatch and pulled with all my remaining strength. The metal groaned, resisting for a moment before giving way with a loud creak. I flung it open and scrambled inside, not caring where it led as long as it got me away from the spiders. I barely had time to pull the hatch closed behind me before the spiders reached the spot where I had fallen. I could hear them above, scratching at the metal, their frustration clear. But the hatch held firm, and for the first time since setting foot on this cursed island, I allowed myself a flicker of hope. The space I had dropped into was dark, cold, and smelled of damp earth, but it was safe, for now. I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness to reveal a narrow tunnel stretching out in front of me. The walls were rough, carved from the rock, and the air was stale. But there was something about this place that felt different, almost protected. With no other options, I started down the tunnel, the beam of my flashlight guiding my steps. The deeper I went, the quieter it became, until the sounds of the spiders above faded away entirely. The oppressive weight of the jungle lifted, replaced by a strange sense of calm. The tunnel seemed to twist and turn, leading me ever deeper into the island. But I pressed on, driven by a desperate need to find safety. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel opened up into a large cavern. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols that seemed ancient, their meaning lost to time. But at the center of the cavern, bathed in a soft, ethereal light, was something that made my heart stop. A ship. A small ancient vessel. Its wood weathered and cracked, yet still intact. It looked like it had been here for centuries, untouched by the outside world. And inside, nestled among the rotting boards, was a treasure. A hoard of gold, jewels, and artifacts that glittered in the soft light. But it wasn't the treasure that caught my eye. It was what lay beside it. A skeleton, its bones bleached white, sat propped up against the side of the ship, a weathered map clutched in its bony fingers. But there was something about this skeleton, something that made me pause. Around its neck was a pendant, a small, intricately carved spider, identical to the ones that had hunted me. I stepped closer, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch the map. As soon as my fingers brushed the parchment, a shock ran through me. A vision, a memory, not my own, but that of the person who had once held this map. Images flashed before my eyes. A group of explorers just like us, searching for treasure on this island, but they had been betrayed by one of their own. A man who had unleashed the spiders, thinking he could control them. He had been wrong. The spiders had claimed the island, turning it into a death trap for any who dared to set foot on it. But the pendant? The pendant was the key. The spiders feared it, respected it, as if it held some power over them. I ripped the pendant from the skeleton's neck, feeling its weight in my hand. This was my way out. The spiders wouldn't touch me as long as I had this. I knew it, deep in my bones. Clutching the pendant tightly, I turned and ran back the way I had come, the tunnel seeming to guide me, pulling me towards the surface. When I reached the hatch, I hesitated for just a moment, then pushed it open. The jungle was still, the spiders nowhere to be seen. The pendant glowed faintly in my hand, warm and reassuring. I stepped out, the cool night air washing over me, and for the first time I felt a sense of peace. The island was quiet, as if acknowledging my victory. I made my way back to the shore, the path strangely clear, the spiders giving me a wide berth. When I reached the boat, I climbed in, not daring to look back as I pushed off, the island fading into the distance. As I sailed away, the pendant pulsed gently in my hand, a reminder of the power I now held. The treasure was still on the island, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to claim it. But for me, the true treasure was my life, my freedom. I had survived Spider Island, and as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, I knew that I would never return. The island would keep its secrets, its horrors, but I had escaped, and that was enough. As I sailed towards the safety of the open sea, I allowed myself a small smile. The nightmare was over. I was free.